Audio Jungle.
So, Dr. Salt, I thought we'd start with you. You made a presentation at ASCO this year where you talked about the problem of rising drug prices. Someone from pharma might say, yes, drug prices there's some drugs that are very expensive, but drug spending is 10% of total healthcare spending, hasn't changed that much. So in your perspective, would you mind describing why you see this as such a pressing issue and such a pressing issue now?
Well, sure. The first thing I would say is that that's a commonly used distraction from the problem. There are a lot of problems in this world. We could be talking about ISIS in Syria right now. I mean, that's a really serious problem. Why are we wasting time spending, our energies on healthcare? We're focusing on a number of important problems. The one we're talking about right now is that cancer drugs are very expensive. They're the most rapidly rising cost in healthcare. Whatever number you care to quote in terms of what small percentage of the healthcare budget it is, it will be a larger number tomorrow and a larger number the day after because of the degree of escalation. So it's a very real problem, and while we can certainly agree that many aspects of our healthcare system have problems with costing too much, delivering too little value, that this is one of the areas where there is a huge problem, a huge disconnect between cost and value, and one that we do need to focus on.
Before we move on, maybe you could give an example or two of what you've seen as being particularly problematic in recent years, either in the introduction of new cancer drugs, whether there's some that deliver such little value that it sparked further attention.
So there are two parallel problems. One is cancer drugs that cost a lot and do a lot, and one is cancer drugs that cost a lot and do a little. Let me talk to you a little bit about my area of expertise, which is colorectal cancer, and let's just review the last 4 drugs that the FDA has approved, because I heard this morning that everything is wonderful at the FDA and everything going through is a good thing for everybody, and I'm not sure I agree with that. Just last week, we had approval of TAS 102. This is a drug with a 1.8-month survival benefit in a select population of patients who are in great physical shape after they've progressed through all other standard therapy. We can anticipate it'll come on the market at about $15,000 a month or so. It had a 30% neutropenia rate and a 10% febrile neutropenia rate, and it causes a ton of fatigue. Is that progress? Before that, we had Cyramza approved for colorectal cancer. Absolutely no better than 2 nearly identical drugs that came before it, but more than 2.5 times the price. Nothing added. I can't understand why any person in this country should ever get that drug for colorectal cancer, but it's now FDA approved. Prior to that, we have Zaltrap, which we made some noise about a few years ago when it came on the market because it was more than twice the price of Avastin with virtually identical data and no advantage. Before that, we have regorafenib or Stivarga, 1.4-month or 43-day survival benefit in a refractory population, again selling in the range of $15,000 a month. This isn't value. This isn't reasonable. This is a serious problem. On the far other extreme, we have drugs like Gleevec, which have been on the market for more than a decade. Price has tripled during the time it's on market with no additional development costs. These are drugs that turn a fatal disease into a chronic disease, but patients can't afford them because it's now up to $90,000 to $100,000 per year for a patient to stay on the drug. These are the problems.
So maybe Dr. Miller, you could speak to how, as a PBM, Express Scripts is facing this problem. You've been very aggressive in calling out, calling to the problem and collecting data to show the degree to which the problem has escalated. So what can you do in response? What is a PBM doing in response?
Yeah, so, we look at it similar to Dr. Saltz. That is, we actually have what's called diminishing value in the marketplace. Drugs are going up at a faster pace than the value they're adding to society, and this is not sustainable. And our goal is actually to get to a sustainable model. We want America to continue to be the premier place for drug development. We want all these new innovations brought to the marketplace, but we also want access and affordability. And so how do you create a situation where you can actually have a very innovative environment, but also patients can actually afford it? And we clearly are not there anymore. So there used to be a social contract between pharmaceutical manufacturers and the patient community. When a new product was brought to the marketplace, they considered all the stakeholders. The patients, the doctors, the payers, the nurses, everyone was considered in the equation. Now the only consideration is the shareholder. And so if you look at what happened with touring pharmaceuticals, I mean, we can't make this stuff up. I cannot create a character this bad for what they're doing for pharmaceutical manufacturers. And so we need to have a dialogue with really mature people saying, how are we going to actually continue to have this great environment of development? 1,400 products in the pipeline, FDA approving more drugs this year than in any year in history. Yet, how are we going to make it affordable? So what we did is, as you know, we became very noisy around hepatitis C. And what's really ironic about this is the hepatitis drugs were great drugs. These aren't the drugs that Dr. Saltz is talking about with just minor improvements. Here, for the first time, we could cure people with hepatitis C. But the problem was it was going to cost over $100,000 per patient, 3.2 million patients. That's orphan drug pricing for non-orphan diseases. If we were to treat everyone in the United States for hepatitis C, we would have spent over $300 billion. That's more than we spend for all drugs for all people. And so I have to be concerned not just about the cancer spend and not just about the hepatitis spend, but also the PCSK9 inhibitors for heart disease, the new drugs for heart failure. And so when you look as a plan sponsor and you say, how are we going to fit this into the budget? It doesn't fit. So pharmacy costs are the fastest rising costs in healthcare. Pharma keeps saying, oh, it's only just 10%, but you can't have it both ways. If it's going up this fast, that means, and it's only going to stay 10%, that means medical costs are going to have to go up at a tremendous pace also, which means the drugs don't have a medical offset. So they're either going to have a medical offset and you're going to have lower medical costs, which means as a percent it goes up, or you're lying and it's going to go up. And so the reality is we have got to get to a different system. And so we've introduced ideas and different models of reimbursing pharmaceutical companies, both based on value and on indication, to try to change the dynamic.
So I want to get back to you to get into more detail on what those plans look like, because I think that's a big struggle for people thinking of an alternative model. But Jennifer, maybe we could go to you, because at Anthem, you think about the problem beyond just expensive singular drugs, right? You're talking about broader costs that seem unsustainable within cancer treatment.
Right. No, and I think, getting back to the point of 10%, the cost of pharmaceuticals may be limited to the cost overall of 10%, but when we look at the treatment of cancer, it actually represents over 30% of the cost. So it's a major driver of the cost of treating cancer patients. And I think one of the big tensions is, again, coming back to this value question and what do patients want? Patients want more than innovation. They want treatments that really are going to allow them to live out their lives. And a month or two prolonging survival does not allow someone to have a meaningfully change their life. It also, at the more money we spend on pharmaceutical or other technology, the less funds there are to provide patient-centered care, which is, again, kind of a key tenet of what patients keep telling us they want. They want more care, more human touch and more physician and clinician involvement in their care. And so we have to be mindful, if we're moving resources to spend more and more on new drugs, that's taking those resources away from other things that patients value. At Anthem, what we've been launching over the last year, which we call our Cancer Care Quality Program, is designed to help identify those treatment regimens that provide the greatest value, using a program called Pathways. And so if you look at guidelines for lung cancer, and even for particular patient subpopulations, you'll see that there's 64 different treatment regimens for someone who doesn't have a mutation, who has non-squamous lung cancer. Those treatments range in cost from $450 for 3 months to $65,000 for 3 months, with very little difference in outcomes. So how do you figure out which is going to be the best balance for individual patients? And given that our system today for oncology is the buy and bill model, practices revenue are extremely dependent on the drugs they prescribe. So if they're more value conscious, because a third of the practice's revenue is from the profit margin on the drugs, they're more value conscious, they don't actually have the operating budget to be able to take care of patients. So in our approach, we've tried to integrate payment reform into this approach, so that we provide additional reimbursement to the practices when they select a regimen that's on a treatment pathway. And this offsets the negative impact of having less profit margin from a more expensive regimen.
So one of the things that is often brought up by people when you start to discuss evaluating the value of a given treatment, thinking about cost effectiveness, is we have this immediate reaction of, oh, this is going to lead to rationing, right? And so maybe Dr. Trimble, you could describe what you've observed in Europe or in other countries that have a much more methodical way of evaluating whether a drug is cost effective. Do you see problems of access there? Is this something that is legitimately a concern for the American market?
Well, certainly we've observed kind of two patterns. One in the developed world, in the OECD countries, where they've generally set up a two-stage process. First with a review similar to what our FDA does in terms of, is a drug effective, is it safe? And then they will give approval for that drug to be marketed. But then there's a second stage of review. Is the drug novel? Does it have major impact on quality of life, on cancer outcome? And they will use those deliberations to decide whether they're going to buy it for use in their public health care system, as well as what price they will be willing to pay for it. So they're actually negotiating with the company based on the perceived value of that drug after it's been reviewed from a scientific perspective. So that works reasonably well in terms of giving the country, the Ministry of Health or the National Health Service, an opportunity to evaluate the potential benefits of that new agent. It hasn't been, certainly we've seen the most examples of reaction against this system in the UK, where patients and their families have bitterly complained about the decisions of the National Institute for Clinical Excellence on whether a drug should be placed on the formulary or not. And so the British government ended up creating a new fund to buy drugs which worked but didn't work all that well, so to make that available for patients. So the other issue that we're seeing in the developed world is smaller countries don't have the leverage to negotiate well. A Germany or a France are big enough that they can have some leverage in terms of negotiating a decent price. But Australia or Portugal, are countries that are so relatively small and their markets are small, so they've had difficulty getting a price that they can afford. The other side of the world is countries such as India or China, where often people are paying out of pocket for all their care, for their surgery, for the gloves needed for surgery, for their IV tubing, and the families are asked to pay for the medications. And so they are really wrestling with can I afford to buy this treatment and this expensive new treatment for my family? So
it's often said that American prices are so much higher. It's the truth. American prices are much higher than what's paid elsewhere. But that tiered system supports innovation for the entire world, so that if American prices were to come down dramatically, the incentives for pharmaceutical research would, if not vanish, they would be much diminished from what they are. So I want to pose a question to the audience by a show of hands. If Medicare started directly negotiating with drug companies, it's currently barred from doing so, as most of you likely know, but Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, I think they both have this as part of their proposal, that they want Medicare to negotiate directly with drug companies. How many people think that innovation would be harmed? Raise your hand, yes.
How many people think that everything is innovative when you're dealing with new drug development? The last 4 drugs that I mentioned are all Me Too drugs. Is that innovation? How many people are with a company that's working on a CTLA-4 inhibitor, a PD-1 inhibitor, or a PD-L1 inhibitor? Are you innovating, or are you fighting for market share? And if Medicare could negotiate price, would you guys fold your tent and go bake cookies? I mean, come on, it's ridiculous.
We can all go back to our attendance sheets and parse who exactly how many pharmaceutical companies there are in the audience. I'll get to your question, but I just want to ask Dr. Miller something. So if we don't go to the proposal of having government take a bigger role through Medicare negotiations, what can be done on the private sector? So a PBM covers the pharmacy benefit, not the medical benefit. A lot of these are specialty drugs that are in the medical benefit. What can you do on the PBM level?
Yeah, so on Medicare, remember that unless Medicare is actually willing to narrow their formularies, none of the pharmaceutical companies are going to give them better prices. So even if the government were to negotiate, if all drugs have to be included on the formulary, none of you are actually going to say, oh, I'll give you a better discount just because you're negotiating. And when you think about the companies that are out there, the CVS's of the world, the Express Scripts of the world, we're actually negotiating for actually more lives than what they have in Medicare. So the reality is they're not going to get a better discount. Now, what happened in hepatitis, as you know, is we created a sort of the perfect scenario. Like in cancer, we had 2 drugs that had identical cure rates. And what we did is we said, we will give our market share to whoever will give us the best price. And as you know, we created a price war in hepatitis that brought the price down by about 50%. The cost of treating hepatitis in the United States is actually now lower than it is in Western Europe. And so it's the first time we've ever had a specialty drug that's cheaper in America than it is in other European countries or other Western countries. So what can be done in cancer? Well, you're right that we actually don't deal much in cancer because there's very few drugs on the pharmacy side of the benefit. But what we've told pharma is we're going to try something different this year, and it's something called indication-based pricing. And the way it works is like this. I'll give you an example we've used many times. You have a drug like Tarceva for lung cancer. So when Tarceva was brought to the market, it was for lung cancer. It provided benefit. It prolonged life by about 5.5 months. And for a lung cancer drug, that's a pretty good prolongation of survival. The company did what companies should do. They looked for other potential cancers to treat it with. They brought it out for pancreatic cancer. The mean prolongation of life in pancreatic cancer is 12 days. Now, if you think about this, why would you pay the exact same premium price for pancreatic cancer as you do for lung cancer? You're getting 1/10 the benefit, yet I'm going to charge you that same premium price. Give me any other product you buy in your life that would work 1/10 as well, and you'd be willing to pay the premium price. We don't do that in society, yet we do that in medicine. So what we've proposed this year is a program that's essentially based on a 3-legged stool. Number one is we've developed the ability to now do drug claims at the indication level and not just at the drug level. So up until this point in time, all of us in the industry essentially see Tarceva and we reimburse the drug company the exact same. We can now do it at the indication level, which means I can reimburse them differently for pancreatic cancer patients versus lung cancer patients. The second thing we needed was independent third parties to tell us what the value of the alternative cancer is. So if lung cancer is $100, what is the treatment for pancreatic cancer worth? And so we've turned to actually one of Dr. Saltz's colleagues at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Peter Bach, who's created a tool called Abacus, tremendous transparency on how the drug prices are deemed. We also turned to a guy named Steve Pearson, who runs ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Research, a spinoff from Harvard that's a non-for-profit, and they're helping us with the alternative pricing. So we can adjudicate at the indication level. We have third-party expertise to tell us what we should be negotiating for. And then the third thing we needed is what we needed for our fight with hepatitis. I had to sign up literally hundreds and hundreds of employers with tens of millions of patients who are willing to follow our recommendations on what drugs to make available on the formulary. And we've now achieved that. We truly have tens of millions of patients that are willing to follow our recommendations starting in January. And so we've put an RFP out there. Many of your companies have responded to it. And this is mainly drugs on the pharmacy side. But we believe that the pharmaceutical companies want this because they want to be able to give rebates based on value. And this allows them to do it on value. We believe they like it because it doesn't mess with Medicaid best price, which is crucial, because it's really just a mathematical model. And we think payers and patients are going to like it because they'll have access to medications, but they'll have a little more affordability. We think if it works in cancer, it obviously has legs to work in other things like the inflammatory diseases. And so we got to keep trying different experiments because we have to do something that converts this system from a volume-based system to a value-based system. We think this is a baby step in that direction.
As you mentioned value, I think it's really important, as I heard said once earlier this morning, and I couldn't disagree more, can't separate value from cost. The idea of we shouldn't be talking about cost, we should be talking about value, that's another distraction from the real issue. You cannot know the value of something until you know the cost. If I tell you something is going to prolong survival by 12 days, but it costs $10, you'd probably go for it. If I tell you that that drug that prolongs survival by 12 days costs $8,000 a month, you might think about it if you're paying any portion of that. And by the way, none of this is considering the value vis-a-vis the benefits and the other toxicities besides the financial toxicity. I treat a lot of pancreas cancer patients. I've never given Tarceva to a pancreas patient. I've never refused it. I've said to people, this is before we had some combination stuff that we sometimes use instead, but I've said to people, gemcitabine alone was our standard practice. There's a new drug that's FDA approved. Now, you could put that one of two ways, okay? I have colleagues that say, there's a drug that's FDA approved that has a significant prolongation of survival, so we're going to add this drug. People would take it. I would say, there's a drug that's FDA approved. It has a statistically significant survival benefit. The median survival benefit was 12 days. By the way, it gives you an unsightly skin rash, diarrhea, and it costs $8,000 a month. If you want it, I'll write for it, but I don't recommend it. Guess what? Nobody fought me.
Is median survival the right? So, I mean, oftentimes, you're the doctor, I have a question for you. You don't know what exactly is going to work in a patient, right? And a median is just a median. So
the median
how do you
is
deal
the
with
median, that? And so you can look at it both ways. You can say you might do substantially worse. Okay, now you could go with the lottery. Okay, remember, not all the children are outstanding. So you have to look at it both ways, and therefore the median is a very reasonable way of looking at it in terms of giving a patient a reasonable understanding of what his or her prospects might be. Of course, everybody wants to be out on the end of the curve, and everybody on some level believes that they will be. I wish I could remember who told me the story because it's so darn good, but it was lecturing and explaining this idea of human sort of survival. And he said his grandfather was in one of the landing craft on D-Day, and he related the story that the sergeant said, boys, look around. By midnight, everybody but one of you is going to be dead. And he said, every one of us just felt so bad for all those other poor sons of bitches. That's the way that we all think, and that's the way a cancer patient will think. They have to believe they're going to be that individual way out on the end of the tail of that survival curve. But if we're really going to be marketing that, we got to be looking at what those odds are and figure that into our cost. Because ultimately, that's not investment, that's a lottery ticket. So I think that for getting a reasonable look at what the likelihood of benefit is, a median is a very good place to start.
So I think we're going to have a lot of questions from the audience. I hope some people will, yes. Our colleague from MedImmune, I think. Yes, the microphone will come right to this woman in the middle. In the meantime, while they're getting the microphones ready, I might just pose one more. You know, as a patient, I might shudder at the idea that a doctor's thinking about costs rather than just looking at what might be the best possible path for me to achieve that outlier effect. So how do you incentivize doctors to provide the best value, the best outcome without jeopardizing their care? Who would anyone
I'm
like
going
to
to
take that on?
start real briefly. You know, when I was in medical school, doctors did not consider cost. We were told, you know, my job is to look after the healthcare. I'm supposed to write for the right thing, and it's someone else's problem about the cost. The reality is, and the great thing that's happened over the last 18 months, our doctors are now clearly in the mix. They understand that cost is crucial. Every single person probably in this room is one illness away from bankruptcy. And so the reality is we as physicians can no longer play this isn't my problem. It is your problem, and these are trade-offs. To have a family, have someone live 12 days longer and leave, and their legacy be bankruptcy is no longer acceptable. And so we cannot just promise hope and leave people with their families with debt. And so it's a great debate because physicians are finally engaged, but it's taken a tremendous amount of effort to get them there.
So I want to
I want to kind of add on to that. I think, so one of my mentors from many years back, Dr. Quinton Young, used to tell a story about when he was in training, what was the treatment for pneumonia? And it was before antibiotics, and the treatment was called the pneumonia jacket. And so back before we had a lot of technology and treatments, healthcare didn't cost very much because we couldn't do very much. And so it's a little bit of this Marcus Welby, I think, to say that we don't have to think about costs. And when you talk to some of the patient advocacy groups and the foundations, the things that patients come to them dealing with are not even the high cost of the drugs that we're talking about. It's how do you pay for parking? How do you pay to have someone take care of your children while you're going back and forth to treatment? So there's tremendous costs in all of this. And so, any decision regarding adding an extra treatment or an extra test doesn't just come with the direct healthcare costs, it comes with all these other associated costs, which really matter to people.